It was a Tuesday morning. The docket was full, like it always is. My clerk, Officer Dennis Pacheco, badge number 1142, had already handed me the case file stack by 8:45 a.m., case number MC 2024-034471. On paper, it looked simple. A traffic incident on Atwells Avenue, a citation for reckless driving and failure to yield. A civil complaint filed by one party against another happens every week. I have handled cases like this so many times I could practically read them in my sleep, but then the courtroom doors opened and I looked up from my desk, and everything changed. The first person who walked in was exactly the kind of person who walks into my courtroom thinking the whole world owes them something. His name was Bradley Harrington III, 29 years old. I want you to picture this. He walked in wearing a caramel-colored Loro Piana cashmere sweater that costs more than most people's monthly rent. On his feet were tan Gucci horsebit loafers, the kind that run close to $900 a pair. His watch was a Patek Philippe Nautilus. I know what those watches cost. I know because one of the lawyers in this city once told me his client wore one to court thinking it would impress a jury. It did not. His hair was perfect, not a strand out of place. He had the kind of tan you only get from places like Turks and Caicos in the middle of winter. And he walked in with a lawyer, not a public defender, not a legal aid attorney, a private attorney in a three-piece suit who charged $350 an hour and who had personally called my clerk's office twice in the 2 weeks before this hearing, Bradley Harrington III. His father was Bradley Harrington II, a real estate developer who owned 14 commercial properties in Rhode Island and had donated generously to several political campaigns over the years. The family name was on the side of a building 2 blocks from my courthouse. The son had grown up in a house in East Providence with 6 bedrooms and a swimming pool. He had never waited for anything in his entire life. He had grown up believing that money was a magic key that opened every locked door. And on that Tuesday morning, he walked into my courtroom like he was walking into a restaurant where he already had a reservation at the best table. He sat down in the front row and he crossed one leg over the other and he pulled out his phone. Right there in my courtroom, I noted that. I noted everything about him in those first 30 seconds. And then the second person walked in, and the room went quiet in a different way. He came through those doors in his United States Army service uniform, Sergeant Marcus Webb, 31 years old. The uniform was pressed crisp and clean. The patches and medals on his chest told a story before he ever opened his mouth. 2 tours in Afghanistan. A combat infantryman's badge, a Purple Heart ribbon. He was not tall, but he carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from having lived through things most people will never understand. His boots were polished to a shine. His cover was tucked under his left arm, exactly the way it should be. He walked to the plaintiff's side of the courtroom slowly, and I noticed he walked with a slight favoring of his right leg, a small hitch in his gait that most people probably would not catch, but that I caught immediately. He sat down, and he placed a thin manila folder on the table in front of him. No lawyer beside him, just Marcus Webb and that folder and whatever the truth was inside it. I looked at him for a moment, and I said, "Son, before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where do you live?" He looked up at me, a little surprised, the way people sometimes are when a judge talks to them like a human being instead of a case number. He said, Your Honor, I live in Coventry, about 34 miles from here. I nodded. And what time did you leave this morning to be here? He said, I left at 5:15 in the morning, sir. I had to be back on base by 1300 hours, so I couldn't afford to miss the first available hearing slot. 5:15 in the morning. He drove 34 miles before the sun was fully up in his uniform to stand in my courtroom, to tell the truth. Let me tell you about Marcus Webb before I tell you what Bradley Harrington did to him, because you need to understand who this young man really was. Marcus had enlisted in the Army at 19 years old, straight out of Coventry High School. He served 8 years on active duty. He came home from his second deployment in 2019 with shrapnel scarring along the right side of his calf, which explained the hitch in his walk. He got a medical discharge. He came home to Rhode Island, came home to a small 2-bedroom rental in Coventry, and he started rebuilding his life the only way he knew how, one day at a time. He took a job as a part-time dispatcher for a local transport company, making $17.50 an hour. He was also taking evening classes at the Community College of Rhode Island, studying logistics management because he wanted something better for himself and for his daughter. Her name was Lily. She was 6 years old. She had dark curls and her father's brown eyes, and she had been diagnosed 18 months earlier with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She was in treatment at Hasbro Children's Hospital in Providence. Her chemotherapy sessions were every other Thursday. Marcus drove her there every single time. He never missed a single appointment. His mother watched Lily on the days he had to work. He had no child support coming in because Lily's mother had left when Lily got sick, just packed a bag and left. And Marcus never spoke badly about her, not once, because he said Lily didn't need to carry that weight on top of everything else. On the morning of February 19th, Marcus had been driving Lily to her 9:30 a.m. chemotherapy appointment at Hasbro. They were on Atwells Avenue at approximately 8:47 a.m. He was driving his 2011 Honda Civic with 186,000 miles on it, and Bradley Harrington III driving his 2023 Porsche Cayenne Turbo S in Arctic Silver Metallic, a vehicle that cost $140,000, ran a red light at the intersection of Atwells and Dean Street. He ran it not by a second or two, he ran it completely. The dashcam footage from a delivery van parked at the corner would later show that the light had been red for 4 full seconds before Bradley's Porsche entered the intersection at an estimated 41 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. The Porsche caught the rear quarter panel of Marcus's Civic and spun the smaller car nearly 90 degrees. The Civic jumped the curb and came to a stop against a utility pole. The airbags deployed. Marcus had a seatbelt bruise across his chest and a laceration on his left forearm from the window glass. In the back seat, little Lily was in her car seat, shaken and terrified, but physically unharmed. She missed her chemotherapy appointment that morning. She sat at the roadside wrapped in her father's jacket while he gave his statement to Officer Angela Reyes, badge number 2287, who arrived on scene at 8:52 a.m. Bradley Harrington III was out of his Porsche within seconds, but not to check on the people he had just hit. He was on his phone, he was calling his lawyer before he ever walked over to see if the child in that car seat was breathing. Now, I want to pause right here because I need to tell you something. The case that came to my courtroom on March 14th was supposed to be simple. Bradley's attorney had filed a counter motion claiming that Marcus had been the one to enter the intersection illegally, that the Civic had drifted into Bradley's lane. They had challenged the citation Officer Reyes had written to Bradley. They were trying to flip the entire story upside down, and they had come into my courtroom that morning fully confident that they were going to win. Think you know what I did next? I want you to keep watching, because we are not even close to the part that made this story go viral. And while you're deciding whether to stick with me, do me a favor. Leave a comment below right now and tell me, what would you do if you were sitting in my chair? Because what happened in the next 20 minutes tested every single principle I have built my entire career on. Bradley's attorney, a man named Gerald Sims, stood up first. He was polished and precise, and he spoke with the kind of smooth, practiced confidence you develop when you spend your career helping wealthy clients avoid consequences. He introduced himself, laid out his client's position in clean legal language, and then he said something that made me stop writing on my notepad. He said that his client had already had the incident reviewed by a private accident reconstruction expert, and that expert had concluded that the primary cause of the collision was Marcus Webb's vehicle crossing into the travel lane prematurely. He slid a document across to my clerk, a 15-page report, a report that, I would later learn, cost $4,500 to produce. I looked at it. I set it aside. I said, "Mr. Webb, would you like to tell me what happened that morning?" Marcus stood up. He did not have a prepared statement. He did not have a lawyer. He had his manila folder, which he opened carefully, and he took out 3 pages, a copy of the police report, a printout from his dashcam app showing the timestamp and GPS location data, and a photo of Lily's empty chemotherapy appointment card, the one with the missed appointment marked in red ink. He spoke quietly and clearly. He said, "Your Honor, I was taking my daughter to her cancer treatment. I entered that intersection on a green light. I had a 6-year-old in the back seat, sir. I was not speeding. I was not distracted. I was doing exactly what every driver is supposed to do." He paused for 1 second. "And I would just like the record to show that no one from the other party ever came to check on my daughter that morning." The courtroom was very still, and then Bradley Harrington III made his first mistake of the morning. He leaned over to his lawyer and whispered something, and then he let out a short, quiet laugh. Not loud, but I heard it. And more importantly, several other people in that courtroom heard it. A small laugh, barely a breath. But in that silence, after what Marcus Webb had just said about his 6-year-old daughter sitting in a wrecked car, that laugh was the loudest thing in the room. I looked at Bradley Harrington III. I looked at him for a long, slow moment. He straightened up and tried to look neutral, but there was still the shadow of that smirk on his face. I said, "Mr. Harrington, is there something funny about what Sergeant Webb just told this court?" He said, "No, Your Honor, not at all." I said, "Then I would appreciate it if you would treat this proceeding with the seriousness it deserves." His lawyer jumped in smoothly and said, "Of course, Your Honor, my client means no disrespect." I turned back to my papers, but I remembered that laugh. I filed it away in a place in my memory where I keep the things that matter. Then my clerk brought me the motor vehicle history for Bradley Harrington III, case number MC 2024-034471, Exhibit B, and I'm going to tell you what I found on that document because it is important. In the previous 4 years, Bradley Harrington III had received 6 traffic citations in the state of Rhode Island. 6. Speeding on Route 95 in September of 2021. Failure to stop at a crosswalk in November of 2021. Reckless driving on Broad Street in April of 2022. Running a red light in October of 2022. Unsafe lane change in February of 2023. And now this. 6 citations, and do you know how many of those 6 citations resulted in any points on his license or any meaningful penalty? 1. One minor citation that stayed on his record. The other 5 had been dismissed, reduced, or handled through plea agreements arranged by his attorney. 6 chances. 6 times the system had looked at Bradley Harrington III and found a way to move on. I looked up from the document. I looked at Bradley in his cashmere sweater and his Gucci shoes and his Patek Philippe watch. And then I looked at Marcus Webb in his pressed army uniform with his Purple Heart ribbon and his limp and his manila folder with 3 pages in it. I said, "Mr. Harrington, I want to ask you something directly. On the morning of February 19th, after the accident occurred, did you at any point approach the vehicle that was struck to check on the occupants?" There was a pause. Gerald Sims put his hand on Bradley's arm, but Bradley waved it slightly and said, "I was assessing the situation, Your Honor." I said, "That is not what I asked. I asked if you approached the vehicle." Another pause. "No, Your Honor, I was on the phone with my insurance company." At 8:49 a.m., 2 minutes after the collision, you were already on the phone with your insurance company. "Yes, sir." "Before you knew whether the people in that car were injured?" Silence. Gerald Sims shifted in his chair. About 22 minutes into the hearing, my clerk, Officer Dennis Pacheco, came to the bench and handed me a folded piece of paper. This does not happen often. When it does, it means something has come to the court's attention that needs to be addressed immediately. I unfolded it and I read it. I read it twice. I kept my face as neutral as I could, which I have had a great deal of practice doing over 40 years. I set the paper face down on my bench. What was on that paper was a printout of an Instagram post. The post had been made by an account called Harrington Lifestyle, which had 14,000 followers. It was Bradley Harrington III's personal account. The post had been made on February 21st, 2 days after the accident. It showed a photograph of Bradley sitting in what appeared to be a rooftop bar, drink in hand, skyline behind him, smiling at the camera. The caption read, and I am reading this word for word, "Yeah, rough week, but nothing a little legal magic can't fix. You already know we don't take L's. Stay blessed." There were 187 likes on the post. There were comments. One comment from a friend said, "Bro, you really got away with it again, LOL. Bradley had replied to that comment with a laughing emoji, 3 laughing emojis, 2 days after his Porsche hit a car carrying a 6-year-old with leukemia on her way to chemotherapy. 3 laughing emojis. I sat with that information for a moment. I breathed. I said, "Mr. Harrington, I would like to ask you about your social media activity." Gerald Sims stood up immediately. "Your Honor, I must object to the relevance of—" I said, "Sit down, Mr. Sims. I will determine relevance in my courtroom." He sat down. I described the post. I asked Bradley if the account Harrington Lifestyle was his. His jaw tightened slightly. He said yes. I asked him if he made that post on February 21st. He said he did not recall specifically. I said that I had a printout in front of me with the timestamp and account verification, and I would like him to look at it. My clerk handed it across to him. He looked at it. He set it down. I said, 3 laughing emojis, Mr. Harrington. 2 days after your vehicle struck a car carrying a child with cancer. He said nothing. And then he made his second mistake. His second and far more serious mistake. He leaned back slightly in his chair and he looked at me with an expression I have seen before on people who have never been told no. People who believe that their money and their family name create a kind of invisible armor. He said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't think a municipal traffic court judge really has the standing to lecture me about what I post on my personal social media." The room went cold. I have been called many things in 40 years on this bench. I have had people argue with me, plead with me, cry in front of me, and yes, occasionally challenge me, but very few people have ever sat in that chair and told me what I do or do not have standing to do in my own courtroom. I heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery. Officer Pacheco, who has been with me for 11 years, went very still. I looked at Bradley Harrington III for a long moment. I said, "I want you to think very carefully about what you just said to me, and I want you to think about whether you would like to rephrase it." Gerald Sims had gone pale. He leaned toward his client and whispered something urgently. Bradley stared at me with those eyes that had never looked at a consequence straight on and said nothing. He did not rephrase it. I made a note. I set my pen down. And then the courtroom doors opened again. Here is what you did not know was coming, because I did not know it was coming either, and in 40 years of surprises, this one still sits in a category by itself. 2 people walked through those doors. One was a woman I recognized, a city prosecutor named Assistant District Attorney Linda Farrow. She was not supposed to be in my courtroom that morning. Her presence alone told me something significant had shifted. Behind her was a man in a dark suit with a federal law enforcement identification badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Special Agent Robert Calloway of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, Field Office at 380 Westminster Street, Providence. He handed a document to my clerk. "If you are still with me right now, I want you to know that this moment right here is what separated this case from every other traffic case on my docket that year. Because what Agent Calloway handed to my clerk was not a request. It was a notice of federal interest in the case of Marcus Webb versus Bradley Harrington, citing a concurrent federal investigation into a pattern of insurance fraud connected to multiple staged and disputed traffic incidents in Providence County, dating back to September of 2021. The same month Bradley Harrington III received his first traffic citation. The same month the pattern began. Marcus Webb had not been randomly chosen. He had been targeted because he was driving an uninsured vehicle. I want you to understand what I mean by that. The Civic that Marcus drove had a lapsed insurance policy, not because Marcus was irresponsible, because the premium had come due the same week that Lily's hospital copay was $340 and he had had to choose. He chose his daughter's treatment. He intended to reinstate the policy the following week. Bradley Harrington's attorney had discovered this lapse and had used it as leverage, knowing it would complicate Marcus's ability to fight back. They picked a soldier with a sick daughter because they thought he was a soft target. I sat with that for a moment. The gallery behind me had not made a sound in several minutes. Bradley Harrington III had gone from smug to still to something that looked, for the first time, like actual fear. Gerald Sims had his hand over his mouth and was staring at the table. Agent Calloway stood near the back wall with his arms at his sides. I said, "Mr. Harrington, I want you to look at Sergeant Webb." I waited. Bradley turned his head very slowly and looked at Marcus. Marcus did not look away. He sat straight in his uniform and he looked back at Bradley with an expression that was not angry and was not vindictive. It was tired, profoundly, deeply tired. The tiredness of a man who has been fighting too many battles on too many fronts for too long. I said, "This man drove 34 miles this morning before the sun was up. He has a daughter receiving chemotherapy at Hasbro Children's Hospital. He served 2 tours of duty defending this country, and he came home with shrapnel in his leg. And your team chose him specifically because you believed he could not fight back." I want you to think about that. I want you to really, truly think about what that says about you. Bradley Harrington III did not answer. His jaw was working slightly, but no words came out. I looked at Gerald Sims and I said, "Counselor, I strongly recommend that you advise your client to cooperate fully with Agent Calloway and the federal investigation. What happens in my courtroom today will be the least of his concerns." Gerald Sims nodded. He looked like a man who had just realized the building he was standing in was on fire. For all of you who have been watching this with me, who have seen this case unfold from the moment that uniform walked through my door to this moment right here, I want to say something directly to you. People like you who believe that justice matters, who watch and share and comment and let the world know that we will not look away from stories like Marcus Webb's. You are why I keep doing this. Join this community. Subscribe right now, because we are just getting to the part that I think you have been waiting for, and I promise you the way this ended is something you will remember. Now, my ruling. The counter-motion filed by Gerald Sims on behalf of Bradley Harrington III was denied, completely and without qualification. The original citation issued by Officer Angela Reyes on February 19th was upheld. Bradley Harrington was found liable for the collision on Atwells Avenue. He was ordered to pay Marcus Webb a civil judgment of $14,200, which covered the total loss value of the 2011 Honda Civic, the medical expenses for Marcus's laceration and emergency room visit on the morning of the accident, and the cost of the missed chemotherapy appointment that had to be rescheduled at additional expense. But that was not the part that mattered most to me, and it is not the part that will matter most to you. Before I delivered the remainder of my ruling, I did something I do not do in every case. I asked Marcus to stand up. I asked him to stand up there in his uniform with his Purple Heart and his combat badge and his polished boots, and I looked at him and I said, "Sergeant Webb, on behalf of this court and on behalf of this city, I want to thank you for your service. Not just the service you performed overseas, but the service you perform every single day when you get up before 5 in the morning to take your daughter to treatment and go to class and go to work and do it all again the next day. That is the truest form of courage I know." There were people in the gallery behind me who were crying. I heard it. I did not look back. I kept my eyes on Marcus. He stood straight and he said, "Thank you, Your Honor." And his voice only broke on the very last word, just the last one. And then I turned to Bradley Harrington III. I said, "You came into this courtroom today with money and lawyers and a carefully prepared strategy. And I want to acknowledge that you are a young man, 29 years old. You have time. You have the capacity to become something different from what you showed me today. But that transformation will not happen in comfort. It will not happen in penthouse apartments and rooftop bars. It will happen through contact with the real world, with real consequences, with real people." I sentenced Bradley Harrington III to 600 hours of community service, not at a food bank, not picking up litter on a highway, at Hasbro Children's Hospital, in the pediatric oncology ward, every Saturday and Sunday morning for the next 18 months. He would assist with activities for children receiving cancer treatment. He would read to them, sit with them, help transport equipment, do whatever the nursing staff directed. He would do this in the same building where Lily Webb came every other Thursday for her chemotherapy. He would know her name, he would see her face, and he would understand over the course of 18 months and 600 hours exactly what he had tried to take from her and her father. His Patek Philippe watch could not buy his way out of that. His family's name on the side of a building could not undo it. His Instagram account could not reframe it. Gerald Sims started to speak, and I raised one hand and he stopped. I also issued an order requiring Bradley Harrington to surrender his driver's license pending the outcome of the federal investigation. I noted for the record that the federal matter was outside my jurisdiction, but that the civil liability findings of this court would be made available to Agent Calloway's office in full, as required by law. Bradley Harrington III left my courtroom that morning without the smirk, without the ease, without the invisible armor. He walked out carrying 600 hours of Saturday mornings, and the knowledge that the system he had believed would always protect him had, on one Tuesday in March, looked at a soldier's uniform and chosen truth instead. His father, Bradley Harrington II, was in the courthouse hallway. I was told this afterward. I was told that he met his son in the corridor and that when his son told him what had happened, the elder Harrington did not argue or threaten or call more lawyers. I was told that he sat down in a hallway bench and put his face in his hands. I do not know what that means for the relationship between that father and that son, but I hope it means something. I genuinely hope it does. I am Judge Frank Caprio, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching this story all the way to the end. These stories matter because you make them matter. Every time you share a video like this one, every time you leave a comment or hit subscribe, you are saying that you believe justice is worth paying attention to. And that means more to me than I can say. If this story moved you the way it moved me, please share it with someone today. Not because of the algorithm, but because there is a Marcus Webb in every city in this country, and he deserves to have people on his side. Next time, I'm going to tell you about a mother of 4 who stood in front of my bench on a February morning and changed the way I think about mercy forever. You are not going to want to miss that one. Until then, God bless you, God bless your families, and God bless every single person who still believes that the truth is worth fighting for.